All right, everybody. Coming back. Still on chapter 13. But picking up from the last stream, actually started writing the actual content, done outlining it, started writing this scene. This isn't so much editing as writing a whole chapter that I wanted to add to the book. Trying to take it kind of slow, but also I don't want to get too hung up on too much stuff so I can still make progress, because I think once I write this whole chapter out, I'm sure I'll have to come back to it and rejigger it a little bit so I spend the right amount of time on the right things and get the right imagery. To briefly recap, I've just started. This is a flashback. I'm writing a flashback where a side character, Demira, secondary character, Demira, is in the desert looking for something in the sands, sort of a covert operation. She's working with Davos, who is another secondary or even tertiary character. And this scene is really this chapter is really to establish her relationship with Davos. Well, this chapter is really to establish the point where Demira realizes that she actually wants to defect from the military organization that she works for. She's like a secret agent type, special whatever, super soldier. She's like a super soldier essentially. Hey, Masculine Cabus, welcome back. She's not. Demira's not the protagonist. She's a secondary character who, when I wrote the first draft of this book, I briefly show her in like the first act or maybe at the beginning of the second act, and then she has a bigger role in the third act. And I really wanted to go back and buff up her storyline a little bit and give the reader a little bit more to connect with the character, and ultimately she ends up making some sacrifices at the end of the book, and those felt a little bit hollow because she didn't get enough character development previously. So that's why I've added basically 3 chapters in the first 2 halves of the book. The first 2 acts of the book in order to give her that character development and also provide some more backstory, essentially. So this is the last of these sort of 3 chapters I'm devoting to Demira, and this is sort of like at a turning point of her character development, and it'll definitely be foreshadowing of what happens to the main character when Demira and the main character Anna, the main protagonist Anna, they're going to meet in the next chapter after this. So this is sort of also building up some tension to that effect. And Davos here, as I mentioned, he's like a tertiary character who doesn't really get much screen time or much dialogue or anything like that. But this is nice too, because then we get to see a little bit more of Davos and why her and Demir end up being friends. So they're in the desert. They're on this sort of covert mission with metal detectors. What they're actually trying to find, Demir doesn't know this, but what they're trying to find essentially is this like 1,000-year-old like bomb shelter bunker for reasons. They're going to be able to use it to sneak into some enemy base and do some yada 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 stuff in the third act. So this is a little bit of foreshadowing for that stuff that's going to happen. Demira is so far has kind of just been playing nice and pretending to be buddy with Davos, but in reality she's been sent in by the RSA, which is the like military organization that she works for. They've sort of sent her in to try and infiltrate this group that Davos is part of called the Convergence, and she's supposed to figure out what he's trying to do, what his whole plot is. And so that's really come to head here. She's about to learn what the Convergence is like, what their game plan is, what they're trying to do, how they're trying to mess things up. They're sort of this like rebel whatever group. And so Demira's going to finally get the intel, but then ultimately she's going to end up in this chapter, deciding to defect from the RSA because she realizes that they're not quite who she thinks they were. Anyways, a lot of stuff. I'm just working on this is the very beginning of this chapter / scene, and trying to establish some rapport between Demira and Davos, because we haven't seen that yet. And specifically, I'm trying to connect, having some chit chat about food and family, because they both have a lot of, like, a significantly different connection to their families, whereas Davos says, well, let me just read it through. You never had a Russell's nap? Demira looked up from her metal detector. It wasn't detecting anything anyways. What? She said to Davos. Davos was leaning on his metal detector, taking a swig from a canteen gripped in a chrome hand. A Russell's nap, you ever heard of them? I'll make you some when we get back. What goes into them? What goes in them? That's too formal. What goes in them? Whatever you can rustle up to make in them in a snap. That doesn't roll off the tongue as much as I like. My dad used to make them out of leftover pumpkin buckwheat grit. So I kind of like a cross between a cookie and a cracker, depending on if you'd run out of sugar or not. I could go right into the next thing, which is which I've noted here. I want Davos to ask Demira about what her favorite childhood treat was, which is going to be a little bit awkward because Demira comes from a really fancy, privileged upbringing, and so they have like an in-house chef make everything out of the most expensive, nice stuff, whereas Davos, he had a harder life growing up and whatnot. How about you? So I'm trying to solve this. I'm trying to Davos is a really friendly guy, which is the opposite of what Demira assumed he would be. So I want him to come off as like a friendly, jolly kind of character to some degree. And I'm saying that because I'm thinking maybe he might be so sensitive that in this scene he doesn't want to make her feel bad about like, oh, you haven't heard of them. So maybe he'll say something like they're regional. Maybe he'll add an excuse for Demira so she doesn't have to make an excuse, because he's that kind of guy. He's the kind of guy who's there to help other people out. So he's the kind of guy who'd probably make an excuse for somebody so they wouldn't have to make an excuse and be awkward. How do I want to write that? And probably a regional thing. I have it. Probably a regional thing, or maybe got a different name of this side of the Atlantic. Because he's from like Eastern Europe or something like that. What was your favorite? He's also trying to make small talk. I'll say that, yeah. Davos doesn't totally trust Demira yet either. She's kind of a newbie in this group that they're a part of. And this mission is a little bit of like her first mission as part of this group, the Convergence. So he's also trying to like feel her out a little bit here too. What about you? He's gonna kind of double flub it here. He's gonna say your dad or mom make you have a special treat that they make you growing up. That sounds sufficiently colloquial for now. You growing up. Let's keep the grammar broken just so it sounds more earnest or whatever. I'd use justified font. I don't know, it makes me feel fancy. Or justified margins or spacing or whatever you call it. This is a big block of text. I'm okay with that for now, but maybe when I come back to this, I'll... Alright, so now I want to do... now Demira's going to have some internal monologue. One of the things I'm trying to do... yeah, it's... yeah, it's tricky. It's something that I need to do. I need to go back and revisit. It's something that I didn't... Writing characters' backstory in a way where I don't just say, here's their backstory, is kind of... is also a challenge for me. So I'm trying to really go through and basically make sure that every... I mean, especially for Davos, like he doesn't get a lot of dialogue, or we don't talk about him a lot, so I don't have a lot of opportunities to get across to people what his background is, so I'm trying to do everything I can to find intersections between his life experiences and the main character's life experiences so they can have an authentic conversation, and try to just kind of cram in hints about backstory, because I don't want to like spend a lot of time on Davos, to be honest. He's not that important of a character. He's kind of here to do some cool stuff in third act, and he's a friend of Demira, but like she's already a secondary character, so yeah. He's also kind of like a stand-in of like, he's the only... I mean, he's largely here for Demira's character development, and she's like a secondary character. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. Anyway, so I do some internal monologue for Demira, and I think one of the things, that I'm trying to be conscientious about when I'm editing, and especially when I'm like writing in new scenes, in this first pass of my book, is to establish the perspective in the chapter or scene that I'm writing, because I'm writing in like a third person perspective, but I am trying to be conscientious to make sure that I think people can ascribe a perspective to scenes that they're reading that have multiple characters, even if it's written in third person. For example, I'm about to write some internal monologue for Demira, which means that this scene is in, even though it's third person, it's kind of from Demira's perspective, if that makes sense. It's one of the tips I read on a really commonly recommended book for fiction writers. I think it was called Self-Editing for Fiction Writers, if I remember it. I think that's what it was called. It was a really great read. It was a very short read, really great read, and they had a great chapter on perspective and like narrative distance, to make sure that it had a lot of tips on like when you're writing with multiple characters, that you, even if it's third person, you understand who the focus is on and make sure that things are written in that perspective. Like another example would be if I wanted to use some sort of metaphor to describe how something looked or felt or sounded or whatever, to use like a metaphor that's appropriate to the person who's the focus of that scene. Like Demira, her background is in, like, she has like a really posh, well, not posh, she's not royal or anything, but she has like a really privileged background, so she would never use a metaphor that only somebody who like grew up on a farm would use. She would use a metaphor that's, and even though she's not talking, like I'm not saying she would say it, but if I'm using a metaphor to describe something that she's experiencing, I would use a metaphor that'd be drawn from her personality. And that's like, I feel like another tip that Self-Editing for Fiction Writers had to help establish people's backgrounds, because just in like the ambient descriptions you can do that, or at least that's what that's what it suggested when I'm trying to do with some of these scenes. So anyways, I'm about to do internal monologue here, which I'm trying to go through and be consistent about how I do it in this book going on. I used to do a lot of italic internal monologue, or I would say she thought, or the thought crossed her mind, or things like that. And another suggested from that self-editing book was to not call so much direct attention to it, like just get more organic and get rid of specifying it, because if you need to specify it, then the perspective of the scene, that might mean that the perspective of the scene isn't clear enough for the reader to know who it's coming from. So that's what I'm thinking about now, is this scene clear enough? And I think it is, because we open the scene with there's only two people in this scene. We open with one person saying something, and I'm like specifically not attributing that Davos is saying this, and then I give Demira as the first name and an action of her like looking up to see what's going on, and then she says something to Davos. So I'm trying to, even though it's in third person, I'm trying to put it in Demira's perspective, so that hopefully when I go into this internal monologue now, it's clear that it's Demira's internal monologue. Sorry for the rant, and I'm also just stalling because I know exactly what I'm going to write on these things. What I'm trying to write here. What's the example? Trying to write an info dump. So how do I just, I want to be an officer. I mean, he's the kind of guy who do that, and his girls go about. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I honestly think that I'm putting a lot more thought into this chapter than I have in the rest of the book, because I've info dumped and done a lot of stuff that I need to show not tell in this whole book. So I'm trying to write this chapter with trying to make it all show from the beginning. And we'll see how that turns out. Okay, I'm gonna actually write this internal monologue. Let's see. Alright, I need a dish. I'm sure Demira would have. So what's Demira's personality? What would be? I mean, just because her parents didn't make her treats growing up. Okay, yeah, okay. I could probably put in the fact that she has slightly absent parents to some degree. Like, maybe her mother would have a special treat sent to her when she was going to be home by herself, maybe, or maybe like a sad this is a sad birthday trope, which I guess I won't knock it. Sad to have a sad birthday. Maybe she could recall like a fancy cake, like a luxe birthday cake that she had, but maybe she had to sign for the package herself because her parents weren't home, and then she opened it and maybe she cut a piece and had it herself. Sad birthday cake trope is pretty popular, but doesn't mean it doesn't work. Is that too sterile? Maybe that's not that bad. Hey, Talon Arthur, thanks for following. Trying to think of a sad special treat. It's also, so another personality trait of Demira, and the main one, honestly, that I'm trying to get across for her, is that she is, as she grew up, she was constantly trying to seek approval or validation from the from her parents, and then she ended up not getting it, so she kind of rebelled and went and worked for the military, which her parents thought was kind of too lowbrow for the status of their family. And in the military, she actually also doesn't end up getting. She also seeks approval, but ends up not getting that validation from them. Um, and that's also kind of part of what's going to run into her defecting later on in this scene. Long story short, her emotional path is about, honestly, about like seeking and not getting validation. So I'm also wondering if this sad childhood trait could be focused around validation. Like maybe she baked her own. Maybe. Yeah, maybe she baked her own birthday cake because she wanted her mother or her father to do an activity with her. Oh, am I putting too much into this one or two sentences? I don't think so. I think it's fine, as long as I can keep it concise when I actually write it. So maybe she baked her own birthday cake once because she was hoping that her mother and her father would do that activity with her, but they ended up not. And so she ended up doing it herself. And what would be even more tragic is if maybe her parents forgot that she was doing that, bought her a birthday cake from some fancy place, and then at the party they ended up bringing that cake out instead of the one that she made. Wouldn't that be tragic? I think that sounds pretty tragic. Let's see, Demira. It's not me writing. This is me outlining. Demira baked her own cake for her birthday party. But parents, hey, it's Angie. Thanks for following. Hope I'm saying it right. But her parents brought out a store-bought, expensive, roofie cake instead, which made her feel bad because she knew her parents didn't think her cake was good enough to serve to the guests. Okay, that's pretty tragic. How do I condense this into not too much? And how do I not make this too much of a flashback and a flashback? Who's this? So Demira is... Thanks for joining the chat. Demira is a secondary character in the story. She ends up being an ally and a friend to the protagonist in the last act, essentially. And this chapter is chapter 13, so we're about halfway, a little less than halfway through the book. In this scene, she's working with her, with a compatriot, and they're both sort of like covert agents working for the military. And they're just chatting and getting to know each other while they're digging in the desert trying to find something. I won't go into all. I'm gonna go into all the details right now. But yeah, she's a secondary character, and I'm running the chapter as sort of like a way to bulk up her backstory and give the reader some emotional connection to her, because she ends up making sort of a sacrifice play at the end, or kind of at the climax of the book. And so it felt a little bit hollow the way I'd written it the first time around. So I'm trying to give her more of a, some more meat to the bones of her story. I think this is a nice tragic way that encapsulates how different her and Davos, who is her compatriot's upbringings, were. I'm not gonna like this, but I'm just gonna write it. We're gonna have to edit it. did I call? What's her mom's name? It's Crowley. I forget her mom's name. Could give her one of those names. All right, but she wouldn't think about it that way. She would think mom and dad didn't touch. Yeah, I've changed my. There's a love interest in this book, and I've changed his name so many times, and I didn't keep the spell consistent, so the control find function doesn't quite fix it. Yeah, that happens. Um, let's see. Mom and dad didn't touch. Well, okay. I could describe the kitchen. I don't want to go too in depth. Okay. Okay. The way I've written this in this outline lends itself to being like a flashback, and I don't want to spend a whole chunk of text on a flashback. I want to keep this scene snappy because we're about to go into an action scene. I don't want it to be like, whatever. So I'd rather portray this in some quick internal monologue, and then we can move on with the conversation, and then they get attacked by the military, and then we'll be there. So, yeah, I'm hesitant to use flashbacks, and this whole scene right now is already actually a flashback, which I do not like, but I'm gonna reconcile that on my next pass of editing, and I definitely don't want to do a flashback in a flashback. That's just, I'm probably gonna get rid of this being a flashback in general anyways, but whatever. Okay, how did I convert this to internal monologue? All right, I'm gonna write it badly, and then I'm gonna edit it. Well, I can't. Well, I shouldn't. Boy, special needs. Oh boy, I really don't like this. I like the concept, but this is too bulky for this conversation. And we're already coming off of a pretty big chunk here. Also, sorry for the lighting for anybody watching. I think the lighting is pretty bad, but it's 9:30 where I'm at, and I'm sitting in bed. I'm gonna write till I get tired enough to close the laptop and go to sleep, I think, which probably won't be too much longer. And I'm just stalling because I don't know how I want to write this internal monologue. Yeah, I've been thinking about getting a makeup light. Could be good. I have better lighting at my desk, but I feel like I could use something that clips onto my laptop or something like that. Let's see. Probably shouldn't mention birthday cake I made. Yeah, an IKEA bendy light could be good. Honestly, I could just use, like, if I had a bedside lamp on an arm, that'd probably do the trick. And I'm really not gonna like this sentence. I'm just gonna write it. Don't judge me too hard. Oh, we shouldn't mention the birthday cake I made. For my, I don't know, 16th. And I also can't spell, by the way. 16th. Thank you, Google. Birthday party. That, now we go one. Best of luck. That I made for my 16th birthday party that ended up in the trash after my parents brought out a store one with a more professional icing job. Okay, I don't like that sentence. I think it gets generally across what I wanted it to get, so I'm going to move on, which is what she's actually going to say. And I feel like she's gonna want to try to be like, say something a little bit. What's she gonna want to say? She's gotta say something. Alright, that's done. That. Whatever, you can always slip. I used to make that. Probably original thing, maybe. Probably called something else here. What is she gonna say into this? I mean, she's gonna want to try to hide how different their upbringings were. But she's not gonna say anything like fancy, obviously. Yeah, probably called something else here. I don't think I even need to say that. That's just filler, I don't need that. Maybe there's something... She could just say, not really. My parents didn't cook much, or something like that. Don't really like that. That's not super punchy or engaging. Maybe she'll just say store-bought. Maybe she'll just say store-bought. Well, what about your mom and dad? What about you? Your mom and dad have a special treat than me? You growing up? What would I say if I was her? Or she was her, rather. Hey, how's it going? Chelsea, nice to meet you. What is she going to say? Well, what about you? Your mom have a special treat they'd make you growing up? Maybe there's like a holiday. Maybe she'll just say something about like a holiday. That's a good like way for her to retreat in this conversation, is just say something generic, maybe? Doesn't really move the story forward at all. Hey, Shelby. Shelby. Yeah, I'm writing this, adding this chapter to a book I'm editing. Trying to build up some characters in not too much text, which is always challenging, at least for me. What treat is she going to mention? She could mention something, a guilty pleasure that her parents wouldn't have wanted her to have, and then lie about her parents giving it to her so she seems more relatable. She does crave approval. Okay, so she is going to lie. Well, she's going to say something that she liked to get, but had to hide from her parents because they wouldn't approve. Yeah. It hasn't really helpful talking out loud about this stuff. So I appreciate everybody. Hot on the stream, because I think the stream of conscious helps me honestly stall for time as I talk, and sometimes it helps me come up with ideas. Okay, so she's gonna say something that she liked to get, had to hide from her parents because they wouldn't approve, and she will lie and say her parents got that for her in order for her to seem relatable, because she craves approval. I mean, not necessarily craves approval, but it's sort of her redemption. Her character arc is to learn to not rely on other people for validation. Okay, so what would that little snack be? I could come up, do some world building. I'm gonna continue. This is fun. I did this already with so the food that Davos mentions at first is a Russell Snap, and that is a made-up food that I had ChatGPT generate because the scene takes place 1,000 years in the future, and I think little snacks and cookies and stuff probably have different names in the future. This is a fun little way at the moment to try to inject some of that. So let's try ChatGPT again. I've been talking about food a lot with it. What did let's see. What did I ask it before? I previously asked ChatGPT this. Can you invent the name of a fictional dish which sounds rustic and comforting? 20 examples, please, which don't use any real words at all. And all dishes have one-word names. So we get rid of this, and instead of rustic and comforting, I'm going to say, like, snacky and satisfying. God, I can't spell. I can't even put any. Satisfying. Snacky's not a word, but that's okay. Let's see what ChatGPT says. Okay, maybe a little over the top. Crisplicious, Snacktastic, Munchalicious, Crunchy Pops. Crunchy Pops isn't bad. Bite Bliss, Snackorama, Snibblicious, Infinity Crave Burst, Snackalicious, Satisfy Bite, very futuristic. Munchmania, Nosh Nova, Crisfinity, Snackorama, Nibble Spheres, Crave Bites, Tasty Whirls, Niblonia, Snack Spires. All these aren't quite what I'm looking for. I think. Let's see. How do I play with this? Can you invent the name of a fictional snack food? Let's just see how it took a little bit less description there. These are closer. These are closer. Crunch bars. Let's see, we got Crisp Maps, Munch Bliss, Snack Select, Crave Pops. These are a little bit too corporate sounding. Snack Tag, Snack Bliss, Young Crunch. Crunch Bursts? Crunch Bursts aren't bad. Crunch Bursts. That's like a starburst and a crunch bar together. Let's do it with crunch bursts. That sounds like a plausible snack that slightly implies that we're not in the same time era necessarily at this point. Crunch bursts. All right. Well, my parents. Well, she wouldn't say my parents. Well, my mom and dad didn't cook. Maybe instead of saying didn't cook much, weren't great cooks. Weren't great in the kitchen, but I did. But they always bought me crunch bursts after my parents would definitely like her. She would have had a lot of mandatory growing up. She would have had a lot of mandatory extracurricular activities so that she could grow up to be a proper high society member. So I think fencing practice would be reasonable. She does end up she is good with a blade and a sword and whatnot, and that comes up later in the book and previously in the book. So after fencing practice. Whew, boy, that was a lot of okay, and then I'm going to put a little bit more internal monologue to her, say, well, actually, I bought them for myself. This is going to be too much internal monologue. That's okay. Technically, that wasn't true. Technically, that wasn't true. It was a lie, whatever. She bought them herself. And indulged secretly in her room. Indulged secretly in her room. Okay, we are muddling through this chapter. Probably shouldn't mention the birthday cake I bought for my 16th birthday. I baked. It's better for my 16th. I only say birthday twice. Probably should mention the cake I baked for my 16th birthday party that ended up in the trash after my parents brought out a store-bought one. Brought and bought in the same sentence. Whatever. A store-bought one with a more professional icing job. Well, my mom and dad weren't great in the kitchen, but they always bought me crunch bursts after fencing practice, Samira said instead. Technically, that wasn't true. She'd bought them herself and indulged secretly in her room. Okay. I could either... I think I'm going to call it there for the night, because I think I'm going to have to start thinking about the next scene. Or the next part of the scene, which is to we need to get to the next part of the scene, which is the Demira being notified, in her comms by her boss. by her commanding officer that they're being attacked. And I want to jump to that quickly. I mean, let me see how many words are we at on this chapter so far. 206 words. Okay, so we're like, I've usually been writing about like 2,000 to 3,000 word chapters. So we're about 10% through, and there's like a lot that we need to cover in this chapter, and I don't want it to like drag on too much. So I think I'm gonna call it a night there. Pick this up probably tomorrow night. Thanks everybody who joined. Great seeing everybody in the chat, and hope everybody has a good rest of their day wherever you are, and thanks for the suggestions. Talk to you later.